Among an ocean of unfair and bad ideas I've seen in the first year I've been in Congress is one straight out of the regressive socialist fantasy bucket. It was like they went, oh, look at this one. This is a horrible idea. Let's try to make this one a law. So they wanted to take the district, let me say that again, the District of Columbia. It was created as a district, not as a state at the start of our republic for specific and deliberate reasons. Well, the socialists want to make DC a state. Now, why, may you ask? It's a very good question. And their license plates read, no taxation without representation. That's not true. The 23rd Amendment gave DC 3 electoral votes. It's a city and they have 3 electoral votes. Some states only have 3 electoral votes. Also, residents of DC, they duly elect the city council and a mayor, and they also have a non-voting member of the U.S. House that can vote in committee and also file legislation. And oh, by the way, Washington as a district, not a state, on the East Coast. Well, that's been a thing like forever. If any DC resident, it's not like a surprise, it was juiced into the deal. So if any DC resident is hell-bent on voting for a congressional representative, well, they're all free to move either to Virginia or Maryland. They're right down the street. And actually, ironically on a sidebar, many of them have. I just read an article that DC is bleeding population so badly that they suffered a net loss of 3% of their population during the pandemic. So why, let's go back. Why this big push for DC statehood all of a sudden? Well, let's look over to the United States Senate. Happens to be split exactly 50-50, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, with Kamala Harris breaking ties. But Joe Manchin isn't giving her many opportunities to do that. But you see, if DC becomes a state, well, that means there's 2 more senators in that body. And what party, pray tell, would they be from? It was actually laughable when we heard this in committee. It was in the Oversight Committee, and the Democrats were trying to argue that we didn't know for certain if the elected senators from Washington, D.C. would be Democrats. I mean, are you kidding me? D.C. votes 92% for the Democratic candidate for president, year over year, election over election, every 4 years. This would guarantee them 2 more votes in the Senate, which would make Joe Manchin irrelevant because they'd have the votes to kill the filibuster. Now, that's the same procedural tool that they so venerated when President Trump was in office, when the Republicans had the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives. It's really pathetic. And when they didn't get their way, I mean, when it did pass out of the House, but it died in the Senate, you know what the Democrats and the Socialists cried? Sorry for being redundant there. Well, racism. They falsely claimed that anyone that wasn't supportive of DC statehood was, say it with me now, a racist. Because they argued that DC is a black majority city, and therefore it would be our first black majority state. And if you didn't want that outcome, you're a dirty racist. But what they weren't acknowledging was the fact that DC had been a white majority city for 160 years. In fact, I looked it up, and I said this in the committee hearing, and they were shocked and they didn't have an answer to it. Even Mayor Bowser, she was there and I asked her. She said, yes, I think race has something to do with this opposition. I said, really, Mayor? Because, you know, in 1800, I looked this up, there were 10,000 white residents in DC and only 4,000 black residents. And even if you fast forward 150 years to 1950, there was still a 2-to-1 white majority in the district. And all that time, Mayor, socialist, was there any serious talk about making DC a state? Of course not. Now why? Because James Madison said in the Federalist Papers, the seat of our federal government shouldn't be in any particular state because then that state would hold and have an inordinate amount of influence and sway over our federal governance. This was a horrible idea, and we got to take this terrible idea, throw it back in the socialist bucket, and then set that socialist bucket on fire.